Welcome to the BMEs Professional Development Webinar, Navigating Toward a Junior Faculty Position in STEM, a Women's Perspective. I'm Shelley Sakiyama-Elbert, and I'll be your moderator for today. I'm a professor and the chair of biomedical engineering at the University of Texas at Austin. And my contact information is here on this slide, so if you have questions later, feel free to email me. Before we start, there's a few housekeeping announcements. First, this webinar is being recorded for your convenience. The slides and archived recording will be available in a few days on the BMEs website. Next, at any time during the webinar, you may submit questions by using the online chat function in the lower left-hand corner of your screen. Please submit your questions as we go along, and then we will address those after the speaker presentations. And we've got about a half hour slotted for question and answer, so please do submit questions. And finally, please don't exit the webinar at the end because there will be a very short evaluation and we would really like to get your feedback. So please take a moment to complete that as the webinar is finishing up. So as we're getting started here, we've got just a few polling questions to get to know our audience a little bit better so we can tailor some of our information for you. So the first question is, which of the following best describes you? Graduate student, postdoctoral fellow, junior faculty, senior faculty, or other? Okay, so it looks like we've got a good mix of people here, mainly postdocs and graduate students. Alrighty, and then the next question we have for you is, what is your gender? Female, male, non-binary, or prefer not to answer? All right, so it looks like we have mainly women on the call, but we certainly welcome everyone who's here, and we're certainly happy to answer everyone's questions. So thanks, everybody. We're just trying to get a little gauge of the audience. The next question for you all is when you're planning to apply for a faculty position. So I'm applying right now. I'm applying in the next 3 to 6 months, next 6 to 12 months, 1 or 2 years from now, not sure, or I already have a job. Great. Okay. So it looks like we have a range of timelines for folks here, but some of you are thinking about applying in the near future, and some are maybe a little bit further out or just thinking about what this process might look like for you. So that's great. All right. And then finally, are you interested in applying for a faculty position at a research-intensive university, a teaching-focused university, both, or not sure? Great. Okay, let's see. So it looks like there's some folks who are focused on research intensive and some folks that are interested in both options. So a lot of what we're talking about in the presentation here today, I would say some of it is specific to research intensive programs, but be sure to ask questions as we go through the process if you see things and you wonder whether or not they apply to the teaching focused positions or teaching focused universities as well. All right, so thanks for participating in our polling. I'm going to introduce our speakers now. So we've got 2 assistant professors who are both looking at tenure-track, are in tenure-track positions right now, and they'll be sharing with you their experiences today about applying for and going through the interview process for positions at universities. So the first speaker today is Leah Bella, and she's a tenure-track assistant professor of bioengineering at Temple University in Philadelphia. She received her bachelor's degree in bioengineering from Syracuse University and a PhD in biomedical engineering from Tufts University as an A-Firm Fellow in the lab of Dr. David Kaplan. She completed her postdoctoral training in Dr. Christian's lab at Boston University and the Weiss Institute as an NRSA T32 Fellow. Her lab focuses on engineering functional adipose tissue models for applications related to disease modeling and soft tissue reconstruction. So she'll be giving the first presentation, and then I'll go ahead and introduce our second speaker here. Megan Killian is a tenure-track assistant professor of biomedical engineering at the University of Delaware. She received a master's degree in human movement biomechanics from Montana State University and a PhD in biomedical engineering from Michigan Technical University. She completed her postdoctoral training in 2015 at Washington University in St. Louis, where she was an NRSA F32 recipient. Okay, and with that, I'm going to turn it over to Leah.
All right, thank you for the introduction. And nice to have you all on the line today, especially if you're on the East Coast and you have terrible weather like we do. Thank you for making the time to spend this with us. So I just want to go quickly through my path and just give you a sense of sort of where my mindset was as I navigated the process early on in my training. So I started with my bachelor's degree that was in bioengineering at Syracuse University, and at the time I felt like I needed more research experience because I thought I wanted to go down the career path as a faculty member, but I didn't feel like I had enough experience, real life experience, before committing to the PhD. So I worked for a few years. At that stage, I felt being in that lab, I was definitely inspired to be on the faculty career path. And I really made an effort to keep in touch with the people who are going through the process, so I had a good sense of what to expect. And I think at any stage you should be trying to do that, trying to hear people's experiences, because as you'll learn, there's a lot going on, and it really helps to hear from other people what they've gone through. Next, I got my PhD in the Kaplan Lab at Tufts. Here, I really knew that I wanted to diversify my skill set from what I had before, and also grow my CV. So I tried to be as well-rounded as possible. That included whatever little bit of outreach, papers, professional development, applying for grants with my advisor, applying for independent grants. I also tried really hard to strategize where to do my postdoc in a way that would enhance my what I call training portfolio. So this gave me an opportunity to really reflect on where I might have gaps in my training and where I would be able to have time to improve, at least during my postdoc time, so that I had time to make myself a well-rounded candidate. So it really helps, I think, if you're in the PhD stage, to be reflective of where you need to fill in gaps. And then when you're in the postdoc level, make sure you're doing what you can to really help diversify your skill set. So when I transitioned into my postdoc position, I was really thinking at this stage about how to, build my unique research program. And the critical thing there is really, thinking about how you're going to be different than your advisors, both your postdoc and your PhD advisor. And really just, sort of planning out what you envision your lab to look like. That's a lot to think about when you're an early stage postdoc, but it doesn't hurt to start early, at least on kind of, getting the gears turning and just really thinking a little bit and reflecting on what you really envision for yourself. At this time, I also applied for grants with my advisor. I learned sort of all the other requisite parts of grants, so it's not just about the research proposal, but it's about the facilities and letters and collaborators and how to best optimize your chances with which institutes you're applying for. So I tried my best to kind of pick his brain and learn all that extra stuff about what it takes to get and secure research grants. I also use this time to try to pick my advisor's brain on how to run a lab, so not just how to do the research, but actually how to run your own independent program. So if you talk to your advisors early and often, it really helps at least help them guide you a little bit better in this process. If they don't know really what you want to do, obviously they can't be as helpful. All right, so I think one of the biggest questions is, how do you know you're ready? And that's a really tough question because I'm sure everybody sort of arrives at their, ready moment differently. But this is where I think it's really important to engage others, especially your advisors. They're going to know best, in terms of, are you ready? Do you have enough to be a strong candidate? So it's about papers, it's about maturity in your research, it's about knowing how to approach research problems. And for me, honestly, I just had this feeling that I was ready. I didn't feel like if I stayed in my postdoc lab, I was going to get that much more done. I just felt, I felt independent enough. I felt like I'd learned enough. And I just felt really good about making this next step. And when I spoke with my advisor, he also felt similarly. So the one thing that I would advise is thinking very clearly about not applying too early in your postdoc, because what happens is that some reviewers will see that, or review committees would see that and think that you're still too green. And you also don't want to be too late on the postdoc and without a lot to show for it. So if my advisor told me if I was to stay those extra, say, like a year or two, where I didn't feel like I was being too productive or would get too much more out of it, he suggested it's better to start a little early instead of waiting for, that science paper or nature paper that might not happen. So I think just a lot of it's being honest with yourself and having these conversations with your advisor. Also, not related necessarily to the research side of it, but I think it really helps to be honest with yourself about your career goals and the life you envision for yourself. This is a hard job. It's not easy. It takes a lot of time, takes a lot of emotional effort as well. And so really start thinking if this is what you really envision for yourself. It's really fun and exciting if this is what makes you happy. But really think about your personal goals with this career, because it is a lot of work, and it is tolling at times. Also, if you have a partner, start thinking potentially about discussing the two-body problem. I had made a few assumptions here and there about what my partner might be okay with. So you don't want to run into the problem where you're getting an offer and then you find out at that point your partner's not necessarily comfortable with that area. So I would, just like with your advisor, start having these discussions with your partner if you have one early on in the process. And then think about where you see yourself. So location is a big issue for a lot of people. Make sure you're applying to places that you're really comfortable, you can imagine living in. Same thing with department type. So new departments are very different than older established departments. So really think of your goals with what you want in your career. Also, similarly, public versus private schools might have different concerns. So just be thinking about that when you're applying. All right. So I mentioned this a few times. Make sure to be talking about others, talking to others about their experiences, and try to have representatives from senior and junior faculty pools, because they're going to give you very different insight, and you can definitely learn from both. And that's very important. Just kind of seeing the longer term trajectory and what you should be thinking about very early on is going to be well reflected through a senior faculty, not a junior faculty necessarily, because they're going through the process at that time. So try to talk to people as much as you can, and make sure that you get a range of different groups represented, so senior and junior faculty, and potentially from med schools versus engineering schools, because they're all going to have different concerns that come up. And keep in mind that this is the career is not what you necessarily trained for, and there's a lot of on-the-job training. So again, just being prepared for what to expect really helps. All right, so definitely doing your research on the different faculty positions is critical, not only just so that you understand what you're getting yourself into, but so that you're tailoring your application appropriately. So you don't want to show your review committee that you're not thinking seriously about what this position really entails. So you're going to be tailoring all your applications for the position specifically, and you don't want to look like you're not prepared. So think about what you would want, whether it's tenure-track assistant professor versus research assistant professor versus non-tenure-track teaching faculty. There's a lot of different positions out there, and just know the differences in what they represent. Similarly, you have soft versus hard money on how you're funded, teaching versus no teaching. A lot of those differences come between applying for positions in engineering-based schools versus medical schools. And then even there's differences if you're applying to like an institute like the Salk Institute, for instance. And just make sure, like I said, that your applications will reflect these differences in jobs. So when you're about T-1 year out, so a lot of you seem to be in this bucket, really start thinking about developing your research plan ideas. Get feedback early and often whenever it's possible. It took me months to get my research plan to a place where I was actually happy with it, and if I started later, I never would have had the time to do it properly. And I saw a few people go through this process at the very last minute. They were rushed, and they didn't end up getting a lot of good feedback, and didn't end up getting jobs at the time that they were applying for. So they had to go through the process a couple times, and had they been prepared, they might have been in a better position. Network, that's a key thing for any new career path. Definitely network with people, and make sure that your network knows that you're serious about being on the job market in the coming year, because word of mouth can be very helpful. And finally, not being prepared is very obvious to those reviewing your application or to those you're talking to at conferences. So be prepared, think critically about your research plans early, and try to just get that feedback so that you look prepared when you're talking to the people who might end up offering you a job in the future. All right, and finally, my closing notes are: have fun with the process, enjoy it. You're developing a blueprint for your future career, and that's really fun and exciting. Just be honest with yourself about your expectations and your limitations, and know that you can only do your best. So you're not necessarily competing against someone else. You're vying for, being the best fit for a department. So know your strengths and weaknesses, and represent your strengths well. That's where, thinking early in the process about your gaps allows you for time to improve and fill them in. And just one small note, sometimes you might have it harder being a woman in STEM, because some people might think that your role or your importance is less important than theirs. But when that happened to me, I used it as inspiration. We work just as hard, if not harder, and we're just as deserving. So don't let that ever feel like it's an impediment. I would try to use that as inspiration for just kicking butt and being awesome. So with that, I am going to pass it off to Dr. Killian.
Thank you, Dr. Bella. Oops, sorry, I went a little too fast. So I'm going to talk a little bit about navigating the application process and where and when to start. And Evangelia did a great job of talking about the networking and things like that. And for a lot of you who are in that 1 to 2 year or even 6 to 12 month area of looking for jobs, getting publications out, networking, things like that are really important. For those of you who are graduate students, I think having a framing in your mind of where you want to be in 5 years helps, and it might also help in navigating where you, if you choose to do a postdoc, where you might pursue a postdoctoral training to help build on that story. So within the last year, if you're planning to apply in the next year or two, getting those publications out, attending conferences and networking. The summer before you plan to apply, that's where you want to solidify your research plan, pick the schools as Dr. Bella talked about, because the academic timeline for jobs is typically applying in the fall. So the applications are typically due in the fall for universities. However, medical institutions typically have a more rolling, medical schools and institutions have a more rolling application process, but universities are typically due in the fall. And then in the spring is when interviews happen and potential offers are made, or you might have second visits. So this is sort of the timeline to think about, and planning ahead is great. So now is a great time to start thinking ahead for the fall for those of you who are interested in applying in the next year. So again, where and when to start, word of mouth, attending conferences and networking. Networking is a little bit easier for some than others. And so if you are trying to develop strategies to improve your networking skills, in talking to faculty that are already at your institution help. Talking to other members of BMEs is a great idea. And coming up with strategies to sort of cold email people in a professional way is a good idea. There are some really great job websites. So when you get to the point where you're starting to look for jobs for the coming academic year, Academic Keys is a great resource. And you can actually subscribe to job postings from Academic Keys. They'll send emails daily or weekly to your email in all sorts of different topics. So as biomedical engineers, we might fit in many of these different categories, including dentistry, engineering, health sciences, medicine, pharmacy, veterinary medicine, and sciences. So be open to opportunities maybe outside of just engineering if the opportunity arises that seems like a good fit. Some institutions require faculty positions to apply through academic jobs online. You can also find job postings through this website here. And for those in biomechanics, Biomech-L is also a great resource. This is not just a great resource for potential faculty positions, but also for postdoctoral positions for those of you in the graduate level. Job boards at conferences are also a great way to try to find opportunities and positions. Typically, there's literally a poster board that people pin, faculty members will pin job postings to, where you can get more information about potential jobs at biomedical engineering departments. And now is a really good time to start thinking ahead for the fall, because the Biomedical Engineering Society and HE have Meet the Faculty Candidate poster sessions in the fall meeting for BMEs. And one way that really helps facilitate engagement at these kinds of meetings is to submit an abstract and potentially get a talk or a poster presentation at the meeting, so that if you do participate in the Meet the Faculty Candidate session, you can also invite those faculty who may stop by your poster to your talk or to your poster later in the meeting. And so it sort of continues that conversation and enhances your network there. And because BMES abstracts are due in the next month or two, it's worth planning ahead for those types of events. So what goes into an application? I have a rogue arrow, but you typically have a cover letter, 1 to 2 page max that you include when you are assembling your application. And you want to start working on these things as soon as possible, right? Because more time you spend on an application packet, the more opportunities you have to revise and get feedback and make it better. And so your cover letter is probably one of the last things that you'll polish, but your CV should be something that's continuously evolving and you're continuously adding to it. Your research statement, that's where those independent research ideas come in. You might include in this research statement a couple proposal ideas. That would be your first couple grants. Start asking potential previous mentors and current mentors or others in your field for permission to include them as references so that they may start working on or thinking about writing your recommendation letters. Some institutions actually do require submission of reference letters. Other institutions might call your referees. And then you'll also, if you're thinking of an institution like a university, you might start working on your teaching statement and then the components that go in your teaching statement. So if you're a postdoc or a graduate student and you've had opportunities to teach, or you have opportunities coming up that might allow you to teach, you could include that in your teaching statement. And then also start thinking about what classes you might want to teach at an institution, and that can help you craft your teaching statement. So make your application personalized. This is something that Dr. Bella talked about as well, where you want to have your own narrative and your own story in your application, setting you apart from your PhD advisor, potentially your postdoc advisor. What makes you special and someone that an institution would want to invest in? What new perspectives can you bring with you to somewhere new is another question to sort of reflect on as you're writing your research plan and your teaching plan. And again, going back to making the decision on where to apply, how will you fit in? So you want to find a place where you could potentially see yourself working for the next 20, 30 years if it's a great fit, and you want to kind of potentially come across that way to the review committee as well. And so in your research statement, you will want to describe maybe what your first 2 or 3 grants will be. Who would you find funding from if you're seeking a tenure-track faculty position that has a research requisite? And when will you plan to apply for these grants? And what will your lab look like in 4 to 5 years? Will you have graduate students, undergrads, postdocs, a mix of the 3? How big will your lab be? How will you sort of frame your laboratory environment? The teaching statement is also pretty important for universities that have undergraduate and graduate curriculum. And so thinking about what existing courses you can teach. So for me, I had already taught a statics and mechanics of materials class, so I could teach mechanical engineering curriculum or biomedical engineering curriculum. So I would include that in my teaching statement. And you can also think about what classes you would want to develop, potentially tech elects that are relevant to your research area, or core courses, again, like for a mechanical engineering or mechanics-based biomedical engineering curriculum, Biomechanics 1 or Statics and Mechanics of Materials for myself. So if you have training or teaching experience, highlight it. If you have opportunities to seek training or teaching experience, consider it. Talk to your postdoc mentor or your graduate student or your graduate mentor and see if those opportunities can arise. Maybe you could guest lecture one of their classes or something like that. There's also CTAL and CERTL programs nationally that help with teaching certifications that might also be worth considering. And then consider teaching outside the classroom and research engagement, education, and outreach. Some applications require diversity statements. These are not required everywhere, but don't be surprised if a university asks you for one. They're not required, but they're definitely worth considering. And if you can weave in a narrative of how you might improve diversity in education, especially for the women in the audience, it's the ideal thing to try to weave in. And so typically the purpose of a diversity statement, is to identify candidates who have professional skills, experience, and or willingness to engage in activities that would enhance campus diversity and equity efforts. So again, going back to assembling your application, tell your story. Try to be specific and avoid glittering generalities. Focus on a major theme and what you want to be known for in the next decade. And spend time on your application. Personalize each application to each place when it comes time. And include examples of why the institution should invest in you with a well thought out, realistic plan, preliminary data if you have it and your PI is willing to let you take it with you, and examples of where your work will fit in with funding, and who you might collaborate with. So remember, search committees receive hundreds of tenure-track applications, so visualizations or schematics often are clutch in making your research statement or your application stand out. So if you have time and you can start working on maybe what your overview schematic would be of your lab, what your icon would look like on your lab website, for example, start thinking about those things now and start working on them and revising them as you go. And with that, I think we're ready for questions.
Great. Okay. I want to thank everybody who's been entering questions here on the left side of the screen at the bottom in the chat window. And if you think of more questions as they come along, feel free to keep adding to those. And so now we'll go to the questions. I think we had some that were submitted prior when people were registering for the conference. So I'll go to this first one here in the question window. Is it necessary to have transitional awards like a K99 or a Cell Nature Science paper to be competitive for a faculty position?
So I think this is Megan. I think we both, neither of us have one, right, Leah? And we both have jobs, so no. The answer is no. But I mean, it doesn't hurt, but it doesn't necessarily guarantee that you'll get a job either. So K99, or I don't have a Cell or Nature or Science paper, and I still am able to have a job. So.
Great. All right, let's move on to the next one here. What do you need to go from a PhD straight to a faculty position, avoiding a postdoc? Did you do this? Would you have done it if you could?
So this is Evangelia. I personally, I would not have avoided the postdoc even if it was possible. It's really hard to get a job without that extra bit of training. But also that postdoc time really allowed me to mature as a researcher and allowed me to help sort of craft who I became as as a faculty member. So it's a really great opportunity to test out some of your ideas if your advisor is welcome to that. And it just really gives you a chance to mature and to gain more skill sets and more opportunities in writing for grants and doing all the stuff that helps prepare you for the position. So I definitely would not avoid it even if it was possible. It's a really great experience in a lot of cases to diversify that way.
And I think the one time maybe is if you're thinking about going into like a non-tenure-track teaching role,
right.
Or at some teaching intensive universities. Those might be situations where it would be easier to go without a postdoc. But I think I agree. If you're competing for funding, it can definitely be challenging. All right, I'm going to move on to the next question. Where is the best place to search for open junior faculty positions in BME?
So I had put in my slides some links that are really helpful. Academic Keys, Academic Jobs Online, job boards, word of mouth does a pretty good job. BMEs has a job boards website as well. Sometimes opportunities come up that are off cycle, which means they come up, in the spring through the summer. But typically, keeping your sort of ear to the ground on when the job postings will come up, it's typically starting in August through November when institutions, universities, departments will put out job postings.
Right, and I would add, I used BMEs, their online job format quite a bit, and I also use Science Careers as another option for getting emails sent to me with my criteria already entered. I spoke to a lot of people and let them know. So when their departments were getting ready to, push their advertisement out, I already was prepared and knew what to expect, that they were going to be applying. So really networking helps at this stage as well.
All right, I'm going to move on to the next question. What are some things that you wish someone would have told you before you became a faculty member?
I think
that's a tough question.
I think the biggest one for me was how do you plan to manage your graduate students or your postdocs, or what do you envision your sort of growth in your lab to be? Some people choose to hire lots of graduate students right away, and some people have more of a tiered perspective. And how do you envision how your mentoring will work? I think is a really good question to ask yourself before launching into a faculty position.
I would definitely agree. I definitely feel that the people management and the time management are the hardest things for me to get used to. And even knowing like that I talked to people and I kind of had a sense that this would be difficult, it's still something sort of that comes up that I haven't mastered, and I think it's just going to take time to figure out what works. So definitely understanding how to mentor and guide people is definitely one of the things I had a better handle on early on.
Let's see. And next question, what are some activities or experiences you would recommend graduate students gain early on that will prepare them for applying for a faculty position? So what do selection committees highly value in a candidate?
I see those as like kind of two different questions. But I think the first question, trying out different things to see what it is that really drives you towards academia. Is it the research? Is it the teaching? Is it the mentoring? And getting a handle on what it is that you really want to build out as a faculty member, I think is really good. And then the selection committees value your story, I think. They value what it is that you bring that's different and or also fits into the puzzle pieces of the faculties that they currently have.
Yeah, I agree, and I definitely think finding that passion is really going to help you sort of find the opportunities that let you stand out. I really enjoyed outreach, and luckily, outreach, sometimes some people thought that that's just something that like you can put on your CV, but people don't really notice because it doesn't get you publications, it doesn't get you grants. But what it did for me was actually I found that I could use it in my teaching statement because even though it was outreach and volunteer service, I was still teaching people about biomaterials and fat tissue and tissue engineering and regenerative medicine. So I was able to really use that as a way, use that passion and transition it into my teaching statement. And so it was a really, I think, good use of my time and my training because now I had, something that essentially fit into two buckets of my career path.
All right, next question. Would you suggest developing a future research plan while still in graduate school?
I never think it hurts to start thinking early, and it might completely change once you do your postdoc, because you're taking the best sort of skills that you've gleaned from both your PhD and your postdoc experience, and you're using that to mold your future. So I definitely think you want to be thinking as a PhD student about how you can become an independent researcher and where you see yourself, but I wouldn't necessarily tie yourself down to a research plan that early on, because things might change as you become a postdoc.
Yeah, I
it
think
could
it
be
helps
helpful in
to,
picking a postdoc.
Yeah, I think it helps in picking a postdoc. Like if you have an idea of where you want to be, you can tie in to people. You can get complementary training that sets you apart from your PhD advisor during postdoctoral training, but also adds to your research story.
All right, let's see. Next question. How do we decide between engineering versus medicine or other similar non-engineering departments such as integrative physiology?
So two of the biggest differences there are so whether or not you want to be really teaching as part of your workload. So in some medical departments, you're not necessarily required to teach. In some you actually are, so just make sure that it's clear for the program you're applying to. The other thing is how you support yourself. So when you're in a medical school, you often have to support your salary using grants that you bring in, and that can be daunting for some people. Other people are totally fine with that. So I think it really comes down to how you value teaching, how much you value teaching, and how you want to support your salary. And then also, if you're in a medical school department, you just want to be careful that you are looking for ones that are really serious about supporting your research. There are some medical school departments that don't care as much about research, and then they don't fight for you when you need resources or you need something that's going to help enhance your research program. So I would just sort of do my homework on each individual department that you're interested in.
Next question. How different is the application for a teaching-intensive university or for a non-tenure-track teaching position?
So the University of Delaware actually has a CT position as opposed to TT position, which is teaching-focused faculty positions. And the application package, it does involve scholarly contributions or ideas but more from the educational perspective. And so while you wouldn't have, these are the 3 big grants that I'm going to apply for to run my research lab, you might focus more on a teaching position as to how you will make your teaching impactful. So going back to some of the potential training opportunities in education, like CIR, TL, CERTL, or CTAL, Center for Teaching and Learning and Assessment, those kinds of programs that might be at your institution right now would be helpful in bolstering your application in your teaching position. And having a solid teaching statement and solid teaching vision is really important for a teaching position.
Next question. Is it likely that a university would hire a postdoc that's working at that university, or is it similar to graduate school where it's encouraged to move somewhere else?
This might be a good question for you, Shelley.
Sure. I mean, typically we don't hire our own postdocs. Typically we also sometimes hire people who've done their PhD there, but often not directly into junior faculty positions. That depends some by university. But yeah, I think when you're thinking about where to do a postdoc, it's good to think about if this is someplace I really want to land forever, I probably should do a postdoc somewhere else. Okay, let's see the next question. Do you have more suggestions for a graduate student about how to investigate whether I would be a better fit in a tenure track or a non-tenure track teaching position one day?
I think it really is going to come down to how serious you are about developing your own research program. if you're going to develop your own research program, a tenure track path is definitely the way you would want to go. Non-tenure track teaching position, if you're really passionate about teaching, that's a better fit. Those are sort of obvious answers, but I'm not sure how else to answer it. It really, I think, comes down to what you're envisioning for yourself.
Yeah, I think if you are struggling with you don't know what you'll like more, I think one of the best things that I experienced as a graduate student was having opportunities to teach. As a graduate student, I advised senior design teams. I TA'd and TA'd a lab, and I really found that I liked doing that. And so I thought, as I was applying for jobs, that I wanted to apply at a place that had opportunities to teach. But I also really liked the research side of things and coming up with my own research ideas to ask. And so those are the balance. I think the best thing that I found as a graduate student was to just try out a lot of different things, and having that flexibility to do that was very valuable to me.
Okay, next question. How many schools did you apply to, and how many invited you to interview? And maybe you guys can address that sort of in a broad sense. You don't necessarily have to give your personal answers, but.
I applied to about 35 schools, and I got phone or Skype interviews, I think at about 8 or 9, and then about 7 in-person interviews. And I think you want to have a lot of options and a lot of opportunities to apply. So I cast a wide net, I guess, with 35, but I was still kind of picky on. I didn't apply to schools that I knew I had no desire to go to. So these were all ones that I could actually somewhat envision myself at.
Yeah, I think that's it. Applying to places where you would seriously consider working there, if they were to invite you out, it makes the process a little bit easier. I actually had 2 application cycles, so I applied 2 years in a row for faculty positions, and I think it's important to be resilient a little bit and know that that's possible to happen, that the first year you apply for jobs may or may not pan out into a position that you would have or be willing to take or something like that. So being able to come back the second year and try it again and use the feedback that you get as well. So I probably had the first year 5%, 10% interview, whether it was phone or in person. And then the second year that I applied, 50% of the places that I applied invited me at least for a phone interview, if not in person. So I had much better success rate in getting an interview the second year.
Great. Can you speak to additional challenges that might be different for a female candidate during this process?
I think there's a lot of literature to suggest that female candidates do not apply for positions unless they feel like they're 80 to 90% qualified for that job, whereas male candidates will apply for a job even if they only meet 50% of the criteria. And so I think as a woman looking at a job application, thinking, am I qualified or not? If it's a place that you really want to be and you can craft a story that's like, this is why you should hire me, even if the call isn't necessarily exactly describing you, that's a challenge that we as women generally should try to overcome. I think that's a challenge that female candidates have.
And I would just encourage you to go into the interview process really prepared, and especially for Skype interviews or phone interviews, really think through what questions people might ask, and think through if somebody were to ask you a slightly inappropriate question, or just one that made you question whether or not you really felt like you should be there, what would your answer be so that you're ready to have a confident, strong answer in a difficult situation? So, because they do happen sometimes. Too.
Yes, they do.
Leah, did you have anything else?
I mean, I was just going to share my personal experience because it shocked me. I was told by two different male peers that the only reason I was getting these interviews was because I was a woman and they needed to hire women. So like Shelley said, I was floored by that comment because I had never heard anything like that before. And I think that comes from a place where, maybe they felt threatened that they weren't getting the same number of interviews or callbacks or anything like that. So I didn't have a prepared answer. I just, blurted out something along the lines of, well, I've worked really hard to get where I am, and my CV can speak for itself. I don't think it's just because I'm a woman that I'm getting these opportunities, because honestly, nobody's going to hire someone just because they're a woman. They're going to hire them because they're the right fit. So I tried to keep my cool, but it did shock me to get that kind of question or comments, and I agree with Shelley. It would be good to have been prepared. I just didn't realize it was, going to be an issue, or that it was even going to come up.
That's good. That's good advice to be ready. Okay, next question. How ambitious does the research plan need to be? Can it be incremental from my current research or something much broader?
So I was always advised you want to have something like 3 different projects or research sort of plans. One being, when you get into your independent position, what can you do almost immediately? So I wouldn't necessarily call it incremental, but I would call it something that is, somewhat secure and that you can get it done, and it's different enough than your advisors. So you can start to make that name for yourself, but you can be productive basically from the time that you start. The second proposal should be, a step more than that in a way. So it should be more developed, more focused on your independent sort of program. And then the third one, I was advised, to make it sort of a bigger project, like something that is riskier, but shows that you're thinking about what's exciting and where this field can take you. So that's personally the approach I took, and I know some other people have slightly different approaches, but I think that seems like a safe way to craft your research statement and your plans.
Another question about the research statements. Do you need to have, for the new ideas in your application, do you need to have preliminary data, or can you go in, without a lot of data for new ideas in your research plan?
I think that if the committee that's reviewing your application can have confidence that you would be able to get that preliminary data if they were to invest in you. If you have track record of doing similar experiments, or you have a skill set that's very unique and capable of getting that data, then having it for your application may not be necessary. But if you have demonstrated, like previously published work that shows that you can do these different designs or different experiments, including that as preliminary data is totally a great idea.
Okay. Is it common to apply for funding before or during the job search? And if so, what mechanisms do people typically use?
So I think Leah, you might have a different opinion, but I think it depends on where you're at. Some institutions will allow postdocs to apply for independent grants that they could take with them. Some places don't allow it at all. Some funding agencies don't allow you to apply for funding if you don't have a tenure-track faculty position. One option could potentially be, once you get into the part of applying for your own funding after you have agreed to a position or have accepted a position, you could potentially apply as a postdoc before you start, but that's like further down the line.
Yeah, I mean, usually what you see are K-99s that people apply for, but you have to do another postdoc year, so you need to apply for those. I think they've moved the timeline back, so now you need to be like third-year postdoc or earlier. And then some of the other NIH-K mechanisms you can apply for as a postdoc, and then transfer them over. Those are Ks are considered training funding, and also some of the transitional programs like Burroughs Wellcome is another one where they provide some postdoc and some early faculty funding. But you really need kind of one of those transitional mechanisms typically. Let's see. So next question. How would you set yourself apart if you're coming from a young lab that doesn't have an established track record?
Oh, I like this question. Leah, do you want to start, or do you want me to?
You can start.
Okay, so both my PIs, PhD and postdoc, were senior, but I think one of the cool things about coming from a young lab with no established track record could be that you're able to, especially if you're one of the first graduate students or you're one of the first postdocs, is you could sort of say, look, I can set up a lab, right, because you were involved in that process, and you can sort of be on the ground floor of that. It also is really important to have that conversation with, quote, your young PI to just decide what you can and can't take with you, because that is a little bit typically less flexible than in a more established lab. But I think you can sort of tell the story a slightly different way than coming from a more senior lab, of that you have a lot of energy with your young lab, and you're able to sort of get things up and running pretty quickly if you had those opportunities.
Okay, next question. Not sure if I want to pursue a research-focused or teaching-focused career. How should I approach my applications for a postdoc if I'm thinking about perhaps a research-based postdoc position?
So senior faculty that are hiring postdocs, typically you're being hired as a postdoc to meet the needs of a funded grant. And so depending on the mentor, the postdoc mentor, they may or may not allow you to have sort of flexibility, that sort of a mentorship style, outside of your project. And so as you're pursuing, or you're doing applications, you're pursuing postdoc positions in a research-based field, I mean, being upfront with what your end goal is, like if you want to have teaching opportunities, you may want to try to match with a PI that would allow you to have opportunities to pursue teaching-related things.
Should the research plans be specific to the university or the institution you're applying to, depending on what resources are available there?
You definitely want to be aware of what's available there, and maybe not be proposing something that requires a $2 million investment in a piece of equipment that there's no way they're going to be able to get. But I wouldn't limit myself on the research plan specifically if certain equipment or resources don't seem available. Think about, when you're crafting this for a specific place, think about if that place is going to have the support that you need to get that work done. So I guess I wouldn't think about it just specifically with the resources in mind, but really, do they have what you need to get your work done? Is it possible that they can get what you need? Can you secure it in your startup package, or are there collaborators around? I guess I wouldn't totally rule it out unless it's like a really specific, expensive piece of equipment that there's no way they can get.
Okay. I want to thank everybody for all of your wonderful questions and participation to help make this more interactive, especially for the discussion part. We're going to be wrapping up here, so thank you very much for joining us. Please stay online to take a few minutes and complete the evaluation for the webinar before you go, so that we can give you some feedback for future presentations. And I'd like to remind you that we have ongoing professional development webinars. These are listed on the BMEs website, shown here on the slide. And also, if you're thinking about positions, the 2018 BMEs annual meeting will be in Atlanta, Georgia this October. The abstract submission deadline is May 1st. So if you're applying this year, you should definitely submit an abstract so you'll have the opportunity to present and network and invite lots of potential departments that are interviewing to come to your presentations. And also you should definitely apply if you're on the market this year for the Future Faculty Poster Session, where all the departments that are hiring will come around to talk to you. So thanks so much for participating. Thank you very much to our speakers, Leah and Megan. And I hope this was helpful for you. If you have other questions, our contact information is on the slide, so feel free to contact us as well. Thank you.